Okay, we're going to look at some problems involving tangent and cotangent. So the first one with the tangent graph, remember similar to cosine and cosine, we're going to factor out that 2 first. That's our b value. And we're left with theta plus pi over 8. The period for the parent graph for tangent is pi. So for here, we would take pi over b, which is 2. And then the phase shift here will be pi over 8 to the left. Okay, so we know that tangent is sine over cosine, right? And we know that cosine has, or equals 0 rather, at every odd pi over 2, and that's where tangent would have vertical asymptotes. So it would have a vertical asymptote at negative 1 pi over 2, 1 pi over 2, 3, 5, 7, and so on. So initially, right, we would have, without the phase shift or period change, right, we would have negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Well, our period is now pi over 2 instead of pi. So that means that this shrinks, and so now that becomes from minus pi over 4 to pi over 4, right, because that's a total of pi over 2. But now we have to take into account the phase shift, so all of this is going to get moved pi over 8 to the left. So that's this is the same as 2 pi over 8. So now we're moved to pi over 8. I'm going to get rid of that one. And instead of negative 2 pi over 8, that's going to move over 1 to negative 3 pi over 8. And so and the next one, again, we want to go pi over 2, which is the same as 4 pi over 8. So the next one would be 5 pi over 8. Okay, so we know in general that our graph is going to look like this, going to have that shape. It's going to have the turning points there at 3 and negative 3. So we need to find the midpoint. So the midpoint between negative 3 and 1 is negative 1. And the midpoint between 1 and 5 is 3. So 3 pi over 8. And so we know our graphs will look like that. Perfect. Okay, so there's our tangent. Now let's look at cotangent. Again, we're going to factor out our b value, which is 1/2. Fix that pencil lead here. Okay. Oh, I wrote cosine. So 1/2 theta minus pi over 3, right? If I multiply through, I get another pi over 6. Okay, so the period, pi divided by 1/2, our b value, so that makes the period 2 pi. And the phase shift here would be pi over 3 to the right. Okay, let's get rid of that a little bit. And okay, so again, now we know that cotangent, right, is the reciprocal of tangent, so that's cosine over sine. And so the asymptotes are where sine equals 0, which is 0, pi, 2 pi, negative 2 pi, right? Those would be normally our asymptotes. Not good scaling there, but you get the idea. But now our period is 2 pi. Okay, so that means that we would be going from 0 to 2 pi, and then 2 pi to 4 pi, right? Because each one of those has to be 2 pi. Okay, so if we didn't have a phase shift, that would be good. But now we have the pi over 3 to the right. So instead of having our first asymptote at 0, our first one will be at pi over 3. So now we have to add 2 pi to that. Well, again, 2 pi in thirds would be 6 pi over 3. So I'm going to get rid of these. So if I add 6 pi, I get to 7 pi over 3. And if I add another 6 pi, I would get to, whoops, 13 pi over 3. Okay, so there are asymptotes for 2 periods. I got to find the midpoints. So the midpoint between 7 and 1 is 4, so that's 4 pi over 3. And between 7 and 13 is 10, so that's 10 pi over 3. Those are the zeros. There's 1/2, negative 1/2. Comes down here, and then we have another one of those. And there are 2 periods of our cotangent graph. Okay, I hope that helps, and we'll see you soon.